Hello. As a church, we're reading through the book of Acts, and we've asked you to write in if you have any questions about what you're reading. And not surprisingly, we've had a few questions about Acts chapter 5 and the story of Ananias and Sapphira, which Tim has very kindly passed on to me to have a go at answering. So I'm going to read one of them out. Dear Tim, I was really enjoying Acts, and then chapter 5 verses 1 to 10 happened. Would really love your reflections on this, please. We discussed it and thought it showed us that God doesn't change. This seems very much like Old Testament God, and that's the same God we have today. But this section seems to contrast so much with this grace and forgiveness they're preaching with such confidence about. And it says people were seized by fear when they heard, which again doesn't sound like the evangelistic methods the early church were using, or indeed today. We fear God, but people don't drop down dead when they lie today. Any thoughts? It is a difficult, challenging passage, but I think it's worth thinking about, and here are some thoughts. My first thought, and I think my main point is this: I think this passage shows us that the church's mission matters and that the stakes are high. The church's mission matters and the stakes are high. The questioner rightly points out that it sounds like the Old Testament God. And I think in many ways that shows they've been paying attention. It's one thing that Luke does all over the place, is he makes connections between the story of Jesus and the story of the early church in Acts and the history of the people of Israel, the Old Testament. Just as one example, if you read the first couple of chapters of Luke's Gospel, the story of the Nativity, it's like you're back in the world of the Old Testament. You have old childless women suddenly miraculously becoming pregnant. It's like you're reading a story in Genesis. You have people in the temple suddenly having visitations from angels. It's like you're reading 1 Kings. You have people all over the place being filled with the Holy Spirit and standing up and prophesying. You're in the world of the Old Testament prophets. Now, why does Luke do this? Why does he keep on making these connections between the Old Testament and the story of Jesus and the history of the early church? And I think it's this. One of Luke's key messages, one of his most important points that he's trying to convince his readers of, is that this is the Old Testament God at work. This is a new chapter, but it's a new chapter in an old story. Israel's God had always promised that one day he would return to his people, he would restore his people, and through his people he would rescue the whole world. He would save and restore all of creation. And that was something that the Old Testament prophets looked into the future and they saw, and they announced it as a promise that one day God would return to his people and would act, and he would put the whole world right. And it was a promise that the people of Israel had lived with for hundreds of years and were longing to see fulfilled. And what Luke's doing is he's saying it's happening now. When you read the story of Jesus, when you read about Jesus' words and his actions, what you are seeing, if you're paying attention, is the same God beginning to fulfill that ancient promise. This is God's plan to restore the whole world being put into effect. And then with the switch from the gospel to Acts, as Jesus ascends to heaven, exactly the same mission is now passed, the baton is passed from Jesus to the church. The Holy Spirit working through the words and the actions of the church is the mission is the same. It's continuing to fulfill those ancient promises. It's God's plan to restore and to save the whole world is being put into effect through the church. And therefore, the church's mission matters, and the stakes are really high. It's a mistake to see this simply as Ananias and Sapphira being punished for lying. Ananias and Sapphira were a threat to the church's mission. They were part of the inner circle, I think, potential leaders of the church, and God is removing an obstacle to the church's mission. It matters because the stakes are high. I think people often ask, how can a God of love do this to Ananias and Sapphira? But I think the point is, the church's mission is motivated by love, by God's love for the whole world. He wants the church's mission to succeed because through that mission, he wants everyone, the whole world, to experience freedom and health and life. That is the goal of the church's mission, to restore the whole world. And that mission is driven by God's love for the whole world. Therefore, he acts at this point to remove this threat to the church's mission because he is a God of love. I think it's only if we just look at it from Ananias and Sapphira's point of view and no one else's that we miss that point, that this is a God of love at work. You might say, well, surely it's an overreaction. Does it matter that much that Ananias and Sapphira lie? And again, I think if you read Luke and if you read Acts carefully, I think one thing Luke deliberately does is he makes comparisons. He gives positive examples and negative examples. For example, if you look right at the start of Jesus' ministry in Luke 4, what happens? Jesus goes into the desert and he's tempted. He experiences temptation, and all the temptation is the same, which is to use his gifts, his power, his authority, his status for his own benefit, to be selfish. And he resists that temptation. He comes back out of the desert and arrives at Nazareth full of the Holy Spirit and full of power, and his public ministry is up and running. Now, the story of Ananias and Sapphira happens right at the start of the church's ministry. The church is also tempted to be selfish, and Ananias and Sapphira fail that test. And I think we're meant to see the comparison. It matters that the Holy Spirit's power is given to people who will use it well, who are people of character. The Holy Spirit's power is wielded by people who are holy. Jesus is the positive example, and Ananias and Sapphira are the negative example. But there's another a very interesting comparison, which is, let me read the previous two verses. So this is the end of chapter 4 of Acts. Luke says this: Joseph, a Levite from Cyprus, whom the apostles called Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, sold a field he owned and brought the money and put it at the apostles' feet. And it can't be a coincidence that those two verses happen immediately before the story of Ananias and Sapphira. And I think Barnabas is a positive example, and Ananias and Sapphira are a negative example. Who is Barnabas? Well, we meet him several times in Acts. He becomes a pivotal figure. He is what might have happened to Ananias and Sapphira. He goes on to be a key figure in the development of the early church. It's through Barnabas that Saul becomes Paul, largely, and the rest is history. Here's something that Darrell Bock, who's an New Testament scholar, says about Barnabas. He says, Barnabas is the exemplary encourager, witness, and servant. Nothing he does is for himself. So it's no coincidence that the story of Barnabas and the story of Ananias and Sapphira are presented side by side. How can a God of love do this to Ananias and Sapphira? Well, let me ask you this: how much damage has been caused throughout church history by church leaders who've used their position for selfish reasons, for money, for sex, for power, for status? How much damage to the church's name has been caused by leaders without integrity? How much hindrance to the church's mission? How much pain to church members? Won't a God of love intervene to show how important it is that church leaders are people of integrity? But I've got one more thought. My final point is this. When we read Acts, is it narrative or is it normative? In other words, is this normal, typical church? Is this what you'd expect to see repeated in every church at all times and in all places? Or is Luke narrating events, some of which are exceptional or even unique, because this is the key foundational moment for the church? The things that happen here kind of set the pattern. They set the trajectory for generations to come. And the difficulty is when we're reading Acts and trying to interpret it, that Luke doesn't tell us. He doesn't say explicitly whether it's normal and something you can expect in all churches at all times, or if it's something exceptional. For example, years and years ago, I went to a church where they said, because when you read Acts, when people are filled with the Holy Spirit, they always speak in tongues. That's a norm. That's what you should always expect. And so if you're filled with the Holy Spirit, you'll speak in tongues. If you're not speaking in tongues, you are not filled with the Holy Spirit. That's how they interpreted it. They took it as a norm. But for example, something like Pentecost, Luke's account of what happens at Pentecost, the first time the Holy Spirit arrives, with an audible noise like a wind and a visible something they saw that looked a bit like flames. Is that typical? Does that happen every time the Holy Spirit moves and fills people? No, I think it's exceptional. And I think the questioner rightly says, people don't drop down dead like this today. I agree. And I think it's quite reasonable to say that the death of Ananias and Sapphira is something exceptional. This is not normal. God judges them, but he judges them in a very immediate and dramatic way because it's a pivotal moment. It's a foundational stage in the development of the church. And therefore we can make, I think there are two mistakes we can make, and they're opposites. The first is we can assume that this is a norm. We can assume that this is typical, and we can assume that this is typical of God, and draw lessons about God's character from this exceptional event. We'd say, well, that's what God is like because this is what God does. God is the kind of person who kills people because they lie, and miss the fact that this is something exceptional. But I think you can also make the opposite mistake, which is to say this is something which is an exception. It's exceptional, therefore we can ignore it. It's there for a reason. Luke deliberately includes it as part of his story, knowing the impact it's going to have on us, the shock it's going to cause, because he's trying to tell us some important things. Do we believe today that the church's mission matters and that the stakes are high? Do we think it's important? It's vitally important that the Holy Spirit's power is wielded by people who are holy. Do we think it's absolutely vital that church leaders are people of integrity? Luke writes in order to convert us to God's point of view on these things. But if we edit out the bits of his story that make us feel uncomfortable, we probably won't have our perspective formed in that way. And we'll miss the point about the church's mission and church leadership. Thank you very much. Bye.